Welcome back to Data Driven Recruiting. My name is Sophia Beck, and I'm joined by my co-host Tigran Sloyan.
Hey, Sophia. So today we're talking about 3 things to consider when choosing an ATS, specifically as it comes to becoming more data-driven in your recruiting processes.
Excellent.
But before we dive into it, let's talk about why an ATS is even important. What is an ATS? As I'm assuming some of our listeners don't have an idea like what an ATS even is. So ATS stands for Applicant Tracking System, right? I think a lot of the times it gets confused for applicant tracking software or applicant tracking service, since the same S, but it's an application for tracking. It's a software for tracking applicants or a system for tracking applicants. And the reason a lot of people get confused about do I even need this or not is the main argument becomes could I just use a spreadsheet, right? Yeah. Could I just put my candidates in a spreadsheet and be done with it? So why is an ATS even important?
Yeah, I think when you're recruiting for multiple jobs or multiple spots and considering a large volume of candidates, it quickly becomes difficult for you to get on top of every single one. Yeah. And also I think when it comes to, you have a recruiting team and you have a multiple hiring managers or people who are involved in the interview steps, making sure that they each know what they're supposed to do at what step, the communication becomes difficult to manage manually. So
I guess when you're not operating at scale, right, where you're hiring maybe 2 people a month, maybe you can get by with a spreadsheet. But when the team gets large, the hiring volume gets large, the need to be more data-driven becomes really, really important. I think there is a ton of amazing features that some of the most forward-looking ATS is built that's invaluable. So you can't just get by with a spreadsheet.
Yeah, it can be a really powerful tool for recruiters and the entire team. Hiring team. Yeah.
So with that, let's dive into what are the 3 main things to consider when choosing an ATS to be more data-driven.
Yeah. So I think the 3 things at the very high level, it's about data collection, data utilization, and data exportability. So
let's talk about each one because I'm sure that means not much to most of us.
Yeah, we need to unpack those buzzwords, I guess. Yep. Yeah, so data collection, I mean, as most people know, if you, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have a good data, you cannot possibly, make any conclusions that are meaningful and useful for you. So collecting data in a very systematic way and, without a lot of noise is important, and the data can be everything, from the applicant, the steps that they go in and when they go in there to, what feedback they got, all those things. So I think the key here when you are, using an ATS to really make this data collection easy is whether they support somewhat automated way of collecting data so that we minimize a human mistake of I forgot to enter the data or, I put the wrong data for the wrong candidates. Right. That can happen and that can really ruin the entire analysis you're doing. So I think some things to think about regarding the data collection is so for example, if you are using some kind of a assessment software to measure skills and ability, then most of the really established ones have an integration directly with the ATS so that you don't have to go back and forth and move data manually. That's time consuming. It's so prone to error. Yeah. And there are also other things like notifications or reminders. So if somebody didn't put in the data, then it pops up and then send an email, hey, you haven't entered the feedback and so on.
Feedback or some specific data is missing or something doesn't look right? So kind of just making sure the data that you collect is very clean, and the best way to make it clean is automating it.
Yeah, and especially when you have a large volume, all those little things adds up and make it easy for you.
So let's talk about data utilization then. So I think we made it clear what we mean by data collection. So how about data utilization? What is that all?
Yeah, so data utilization, I think the really key part, the practical portion of actually being able to use the data is how easy it is to for you to implement that into your daily steps, right? So a lot of ATSs out there comes with like built-in dashboards and reports that you can easily just like log in and refresh, and the data is in front of you. So I think the key things to check when you are, I mean, everybody will say like we have the best dashboard and reporting. So the things to really go and like dig into when you are comparing those things are like, first of all, like you have to know what are the really core data that your organization is trying to optimize and utilize. Because depending on the organization's particular strategy at the time, sometimes you care more about one metric than the other, just so that you make sure that all the key metrics, things like time to hire could be important, or offer acceptance rate could be important, or just like purely like, am I even getting enough candidates for each job is important. Like those things are supported by the ATS you're thinking about using, because the more step you have to get those data to check, like the unlikely that you will actually use the data.
And by supported, you mean that it's actually like a built-in metric into like their visualizations, their reporting. Is that what you mean by like it's supported by the ATS?
That's going to be the best way. Like they already have a built-in capability to spit out those data without you trying to configure every single thing. Or, I mean, in case that you are also interested in more data that's not maybe like super useful or powerful for every cases, then at least having the ability to configure and create your own report.
Like customizable reports, not just kind of everything that's sort of like, because it's impossible for any ATS to cover all scenarios. So like having some way for you to actually build custom reports, custom metrics, and make it your own should be like a key component.
Yeah, and then also the ability to dig in more. If you see that, suddenly in the last 2 weeks, the, application flow from one channel is down, then like, can you actually dig in further into see like what's wrong? So like, so for you to be able to filter by channel, so for filter by job, so that you can really dig into the underlying data within the platform itself, because that's the easiest way to use it. If you have to go many steps, you're probably not gonna like make that effort every day to do it. So
makes sense. So we got data collection down, number one, data utilization down, number two. Let's talk about data export. I think this is most self-explanatory from the title, but it's still worth explaining. Why on earth would you want to be able to export the data?
Yeah, so I think if your organization is, like large enough and, very data driven in nature overall, you probably will have a data analyst group or, business intelligence team that you can leverage on. And they usually consolidate all the data that's coming out of your company, like for your own product and services, but also internal operations as well. So they probably already have data warehouse and all the BI tools set up. So if that's the true, you should really utilize that resource to take your analysis to the next step, right?
And even like if you don't really have someone like that, and most companies do, but like most companies use several different HR and candidate sort of management tools, right? So you might use an ATS for the hiring purposes, but you might use something like a Workday for onboarding. You might use something like Lattice for like performance reviews, right? So if you wanted to kind of tie all of that together, you have to be able to export data from each of these tools and import it into some sort of business analytics.
So you can really append data that's collected outside of the ATS to have a full picture. So use cases, as you mentioned, is like, okay, well, this is what we saw when we were recruiting for these candidates. How do they perform once they are like in their jobs and performing after several years?
Or who quit within the first month.
Right, like is retention like related to a certain channel or certain behavior during that entire recruiting process, or whether retention is, also connected to how well the onboarding has, took a place and so on. So really able to kind of see not only from the angle of like this is where we got the candidates and then decisions of hiring, but the beyond. So even over things like, let's say your company had a big PR push and then had a press release, like, did we see any increase in the number of applicants? Like, I mean, you
like
could
tying it all from your like maybe PR management tools and everything.
Right, because in a way, the brand recognition really impacts the recruiting and hiring flow. So I mean, like all those things, if you can kind of combine with the other data, you can even have a even more elaborate and complex analysis that could help you.
Awesome. All right. So data collection, data utilization, and data export. The three main things to consider. Any specific bottom line that you want to cover before we wrap it up?
Yeah. So I guess for those, the head of talent acquisitions and others who are running the recruiting organization, when you're considering ATS, I think if you have a very strong commitment to data-driven recruiting, make sure that you also think about how data is collected and can be used as an overall one. So think of that as one of the criteria for your ATS selection process.
Key criteria for selection process. Awesome. Love it. Thanks a lot for the insights, and thanks everybody for tuning in.